Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of Let's Explore, where this week I really want to look into the core of what we actually do as testers, which is testing features and looking at whether they are meeting our requirements or not. And I want to do it in as realistic a way as possible. So the way I've gone about this today is I found an API that's publicly available. I want to brainstorm a list of tests that we could do for this API if this is what we were doing in our day-to-day job. And after brainstorming those tests, I want to try and run as many of them as possible. Now, because we're doing this on a real production website, there's certain things that are going to be totally off limits. So there's no way that I'm going to be doing things like performance tests, trying to bring the site down. This is a site that people are really using. And things like penetration testing and, SQL injection attacks, that's completely off the table for today at least. We'll do dedicated sessions on both of those things in the future, I would expect. Now, if you saw episode 0, which is available on my channel, which had quite a few technical hitches, which is why it was never released as episode 1. We looked at an API called Football Data, which has access to football leagues and matches and statistics for around the world. We're going to use that today. I'm going to take you through that very quickly. And once we've actually written some tests, we will run them in Postman. And I'm going to show you very quickly a mind mapping tool that you can use to help lay out the test cases that you're creating to just help get your head around what's going on. The Football Data API is actually a fallback. I had two other APIs in mind that I wanted to use today, and when I went to fire them up earlier today, both of them were either deprecated or offline and no longer in use. So Football Data is a fallback, but it's a really, really good API, and I think you'll find it's going to be quite good for looking at some test cases today. Let me take you over to their website if you haven't seen it before. There's really good comprehensive documentation on their website that takes you through the different endpoints that they have available. We'll look at that in a second. In terms of the data that you can get out of it, they've got a really good tiered system where they have a free tier. So once you sign up to their website, you have access to the data from these leagues free of charge. There are certain restrictions, like they're capped on 10 requests per minute, I believe. And some of the information is slightly out of date, so they don't have real-time information if you're on the free tier. If you're willing to cough up money, you get access to more leagues, more real-time information, and that's something that I actually use myself on a personal project. The endpoint we're going to look at today is one that I've not used before. I've chosen it deliberately so that I've got as little context as possible. If we go to the documentation, the one I'm going to choose is not that one. It's this one that I've highlighted on screen here. So it's the endpoint which shows all of the matches for a particular team. So you can see in the URL sample, you'll pass in an ID. We'll look at how you do that in a minute. And in theory, what you should then get back is a list of all the matches for the team that matches that ID. Now, the first thing we should always do with something like this is what you call a happy path test. So make sure you can actually connect to the thing, make sure the thing is working. I've had the situation in the past where something has been handed over to me for tests, and I've sat there working out an exhaustive list of everything I want to test about it. And some hours later, I go to test the thing, and it's offline, or a bad build was deployed, and it's just not working. And if I told a developer about that hours ago, they could have fixed that and we could be well on our way to testing now. But this is why we do a happy path test first, just to make sure that the thing is going to work and we know what's going on. So I'm going to switch over to Postman quickly, and I'm going to create myself a new request in the episode 3 collection. And we'll call this Get Matches, if I can spell matches correctly. Now, I mentioned we use the same API in episode 0, so I'm actually going to copy duplicate this one here. Actually, I could have just renamed that. So let's delete Get Matches and rename this one that I've cloned. I'll take you through what's in here already. It's called Get Matches. Into the URL, we take the URL from the documentation, which is v2teams/id/matches. Now, we are going to need an ID in a second. I'm just going to click Save. Now, for episode 0, one of the requests we used was the one that gets the list of Premier League teams. So this is going to allow me to find an ID. If I send this now, let's go for Liverpool because they won the Premier League last season. So they have the honour of being the team we choose. We can see Liverpool is ID number 64. So I'm going to put ID 64 in here for my happy path test. And just to make it clear, when you're using the Football Data API, you have to send a header called XAuth token. And then when you sign up for a free account on the site, they will give you an auth token. I will hover over mine here. Despite it being called secret auth header in my code, it's not really a secret. This is only a free code. There's nothing to be gained from writing that one down. You may as well sign up for your own. But if I hit send here, hopefully we have a working happy path test. We get 46 games back. That surprised me slightly because there's only 38 games in a Premier League season. Does this include... What am I looking at here? Am I saying Champions League? Is this Liverpool Champions League fixtures? Yes, okay. So this includes matches that are in the past as well, does it? Yes, that's the 17th of September 2019. Okay, so we've got a whole load of data back that appears to include last season. That surprised me slightly because I was hoping to see this season's matches. Not to worry right now. Actually, you know what? I'm kind of going to worry because I want to be able to make sure that I've got data in the future to have a look at. No. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a note of this thing right now because this is something that we would normally ask a developer. So I've just opened an empty text file. I'm going to show you an example of how you might mind map this later. But to be honest, a text file is where it might tend to be my go-to. It's quite pure. It's very clean. And what you use will depend on your context. But it's very rare that someone actually wants to see my test notes. So I just want something that's clear and easy for me, myself to understand. And if we get kind of meta for a second, I'm recording a video right now. If I discovered a real issue, I could just show this video to my developer and say, look here, here's the thing that happened. I don't really need exhaustive notes about what's going on. So in this first section of my notes, I'm just going to put sort of questions. This text obviously is bigger so you can see it on the video. Get matches without parameters equals shows last season's data. That's a question I might want to ask the developer. Would we expect that? We're now into the next season. Why are we not seeing that by default? But we can still test whether the various parameters of this endpoint are working, but just under the context of the data in here seems to be slightly old. Let's go back to the documentation and look at what we can do with this endpoint. So we mentioned the ID already. So I'm going to make a note in my document that ID is a thing that we can vary or mess around with. So I'm just going to put ID. And what you've then got here is various filters that we can apply. Now I mentioned dates already. You can set a date from and a date to, which presumably is the dates between which you will get the fixtures. And you've got ones called status, venue, and limits. Now the documentation for this API is really good. If we scroll down this page, each of these filter types is explained and we'll go through them in turn in a minute. But right now I'm literally just going to copy and paste this into my notes as the easiest way of keeping track of the things that I want to look at. And it's pasted in a different size because computers can be horrible sometimes. Let's just make it a bit bigger. So we've seen a happy path. We've seen that we can get data back. We now want to start thinking about, well, what are ways in which this might break? So we'll start, first of all, thinking about the ID in that URL there. Now, the very first thing I would think of is, well, what if you left the ID out altogether? So I won't press send just yet, but if you just deleted that, so you've got teams slash, then another slash, then matches. Now, what would we expect to happen? v2 teams slash matches. This is where in the real world, if we had access to our product owner or our team, we would go to them and say, well, you know, it's not for a tester to decide what the expected behavior is. What would you expect it to be? What would the end user expect it to be? And that's when you can have these conversations. The term shift left has become a bit of a dirty word in tech, I think, these days, but it really is valuable for a tester to move nearer to the left-hand side of the development process. If you can be having these conversations before the thing has been built, then you can get these questions ingrained in from the start. You can get them included in examples. For example, if you're using something like BDD and you want to say, well, in the case where X happens, we expect Y to occur. So what would I expect to happen, or what would I guess is going to happen? My expectation is there's probably some code behind the scenes which verifies the URL, and that's probably not going to reconcile as a valid URL. The code probably expects there to be something in there. And if there isn't, there'll be some kind of error, maybe a 404, but it's question marks because I don't really know. Now, what else could we do? I'm not going to type out the full URL each time because this is going to get boring, but what other things could we do with the ID? You could have something that isn't even a number, so I'll just write the word foo. Could be a 404 or some other 400 code. So 400 is bad request. It wouldn't surprise me if this registers as a bad request because foo is not an ID. If it's expecting numbers, then what about a number that's never actually going to be a team, like 0? 0 would pass the test of it is a number, but it's never going to be a team. So again, you might get a 400 if the code has been set up to expect that to be an invalid value. Other things that are numbers but not real things. What about a negative number? I'm going to say as above, basically. Things that are numeric but not an ID, so 1.5, for example, that is a number, but it's not going to map to a team. We've seen the happy path of getting Liverpool's data back when they were ID, was it 64? Let me just undo my change. Yeah, 64 is Liverpool. What about a number which is a number but definitely doesn't reconcile to a team? So like 999999. I very much doubt that there are 100 million football teams in the world. So that's probably not a real team. So do we get a 404 or some sort of error? Let's see what comes back. One of the things I know about this API, I mentioned that they have these different tiers and we have access on the free tier to the Premier League. What if we give them an ID that is a real team but isn't a team that we're allowed to see? If we give them the ID of a team from the Brazilian second division. Might be hard to work out what one of those IDs is. So I'm just going to make a note that that's something I might want to look up. We might not actually do that one in this session. It might be too time consuming and boring to look at, but that's the sort of thing that I might look at. Now, when I'm thinking about IDs, now this is obviously I'm thinking out loud, so a little bit under pressure and literally under the spotlights. But when my ideas start to dry up, one of the resources I like to go to is a resource created by Elizabeth Hendrickson called the Test Heuristics cheat sheet. Which is over here. It's just a list of ideas for when you're working with particular types of fields, things that can inspire you to think of ideas you might not have considered. So when we look at the numbers section in this document, it's got various ideas of magic numbers. Now we did 0 already. It's got like 16 and 32-bit integers, the maximum numbers for those. I mentioned decimals already, negatives we did already. Here's a good idea. So the fact that numbers, when you write them out, can sometimes have punctuation in them. So for example, 1000, that is a number, but would it be registered as a number, treated as a number? And in Europe they have different separators to the other countries. So for example, 1000 might be represented as that. That is probably going to work out as being the same test case as that. The reason it's mentioned in the document is if you didn't have decimals, because the decimals become a comma. You can see how those two there would differ, for example. But for a simple quick pass on IDs, that's going to do me, I reckon. Now, I'm going to run through these now so we can see some action. My expectation is that none of these will do anything particularly useful. When we'll talk about error codes that come back, I tend to always look for ones that begin with a 4. So the 4XX series of codes are basically if there was an error with the user input or it doesn't reconcile to anything that's valid. That basically tells the user they need to go away and do something better. What you really don't want to see is the ones that begin with 5. So like 503 is an internal server error. So that means the server has received the input and has thrown a wobbly. There's a bug effectively on the server because we haven't worked out what to do with the code. That tends to indicate you need to do some more defensive programming on the server within your own code. Now, as I mentioned, this is a real product that's in the wild and being used by paying customers. So I'm not massively expecting any of these to fail in a dramatic way. But let's have a quick look. Here's an example of just running some tests on just the URL. We haven't even looked at the parameters themselves yet that we saw. This is just even calling the endpoint. So if I say there's no ID in there at all, it's just empty, and we hit send, what happens? We get a 400 bad request. That's pretty much exactly what I want, and a really good message back. Parameter ID is expected to be an integer in a specified range. That's not the best message. You know, what's the specified range? No range has been specified to me as a user. Now, as a API integrator, I could go to the documentation and discover what the expected value should be. So the message is probably for an integrator rather than an end user. But again, for questions, I'm going to put... okay, it's going to do weird things with sizes, but could message be better? I'm just going to make a note of that because maybe we can, maybe we don't. I said we might get a 404 file not found, but bad request is accurate. It knows to expect an ID in there and it knows it's not got one, so I'm happy with that. The next thing I said was various things such as foo. Now, looking at the message we got back there, that it's validating it to be an integer, I'm expecting we're going to see this a lot for all of these tests because it's checking whether that is an integer. So if I hit send now on foo, we get the same error message back, that's fine. Okay, 0 is going to be interesting because that is an integer, but it's not going to be a team. Do we get the same message or do we get something like team not found? The resource you are looking for does not exist and it returns a 404. I'm happy with that. -1, again, as an integer, which should probably be the same as this because it's a thing that won't exist. Okay, no, it's saying that isn't an ID. I guess if IDs are treated as being positive integers, that's probably fine. That isn't an ID. 1.5 isn't going to be interesting. We know what that's going to do. There we go. Now this massive number we have with the nearly 10 million. Again, we know this isn't going to be interesting because it's going to say a resource doesn't exist. You see, okay. It actually says the must be in a specified range message. So I guess there is a cap to the number of teams. Now, if there was suddenly a massive outbreak in new football teams registering across the planet, and we suddenly had 10 million teams, could that be a problem? You would hope that the API developer would see that problem coming, but that's how you end up with problems like the 2038 problem. If you look, if you search for the 2038 problem on Wikipedia, basically it's like the Millennium Bug, something else that's coming up that could be a problem because developers kept kicking the problem down the road. Let's go back to a more reasonable number like 99,000, which is probably still not a team ID, but it might be a more realistic number. Again, it says it's not in a specified range. 4 digits? Okay, there we go. Now we get one that doesn't exist. So I guess there are less than 10,000 teams. This brings us back more into the realm of the numbers we're expecting. I've not seen anything in those tests that particularly worries me. Apart from that thing about the specified range. I already raised it once. I'm kind of interested in how the code is doing that. What does it mean, specified range? Let's do the one with the comma, but I suspect this will say it's not an ID. Yeah. So I'm kind of happy, or as happy as I'm going to be, with what IDs are doing. And I'm going to move on to look at more interesting things, which is the parameters in the endpoint itself. Let's put this back to Liverpool so we know that we're getting Liverpool data. Was it 64 or was it 46? 64 is Liverpool data. Excellent. So moving on from ID, let's look at these two date fields together, date from and date to. Now, if we look in the API documentation, it tells us a little more about how these parameters operate under this data type section. So each of these filters has a definition. Actually, the ID that we just did, it shows the actual regex, the regular expression that it uses to validate that, and it says it's got to be an integer. You see it's not got the negative symbols, it's got to be a positive integer using just the digits 0 to 9 and at least one of them. Now, it must be slightly more complicated than that with the validation because that 9 nines matches that regular expression, but it came back saying it wasn't in a valid range. So something else is also going on. It's probably not massively important right now. We'll look at date from and date to, which it treats as the same thing. It's a string in this format, 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, with an example there. So again, first thing we'll probably do without going much further is just make sure they're actually working. So I'm going to do a happy path right now. I'm going to write down that I've done one. Again, I'm happy that the content of this video documents what I've done. I'm not going to sit here and write down the cases I've done. In the real world, in my day-to-day job, for example, when I'm testing APIs, we actually have responsibility to external auditors to prove the test that we've done. So when I'm writing notes, I might actually provide the actual scenarios that I've used. I work in insurance where we run insurance inquiries, so I will note the actual insurance inquiry IDs that I've used because we can then look up in our backend system we can look up by ID and get back all of the data that I use. So I don't have to detail every single step that I did because if I've got the ID, I can retrieve the data and that's all that the auditors will need to see. But for a happy path test then, date from and date to, we saw this look like it's last season's data. Let's have a look. There's a match here from September 2019. I'm going to go straight down to the end and see how far we go. And that goes to the end of the season that's just finished. At time of recording, we're a few days away from the new season starting. So I guess this endpoint will probably switch over to the new season when the new one begins. So let's send onto this endpoint. Just send me the data from matches last October. So I'm going to say from the 29th of October, sorry, from the 1st of October 2019, and date 2 is the 31st of October. So this is my happy path test. I'm expecting I'll now get fewer than the 46 matches we got before. It should just show us the matches from October, and it should actually work. There we go, there are 5 matches, and that one is from the 2nd of October. Oh, collapsed the wrong thing. This one is from the 5th of October. Okay, so it looks like the date from and date to parameters are capable of working, which makes me happy that I can now brainstorm a whole lot of other things that we can do. Now, we mentioned in the docs that it's expecting YYYMMDD. So let's think about obtuse ways that we may break this. Now, the two fields are somewhat related. So first of all, I'm curious if you have a date from, but not a date to. So if I say, just show me things starting on the 1st of October, will it show me everything from the 1st of October up until the end? Or will it say that I need to provide both? I'm curious as to whether I need to do a from and a to. And the same with the other one. If I do no date from, but a date to, if I say I just want everything up to January, do I get everything from the start of the season until January? What about cross-field validation? So if date to is before date from, that's a classic example of data being the wrong round. So if I say from October to September, will it tell me that that is logically incorrect, or will it try and do something clever like get me the September to October matches? Because they're between those two dates. We'll see. Date from the same as the date to. Now, given I've got some data here already, I'm going to see there's a match. Liverpool played a match on the 20th of October. So maybe that's the one that I'll use. I'll put from and to as the 20th of October. Does it bring me back just that match? Because that, in my eyes, is valid. I'd like to see just that match coming back. Date from, same as date to, and no match on that date. So if I give it the 21st of October, for example, that should be a valid query, but there should be no matches in the results because Liverpool didn't play a game on that date. Right, now, thinking out loud whilst trying not to be boring on video, what else would I do with the interaction between those two fields? Date from massively in the past. So date from is a valid date, but it's like, let's just say 2015 for the avoidance of doubt. Do I get 4 seasons worth of data, or does it tell me that date from and date to need to be closer together? And date to recent. I could then probably do the reverse. So date to a long way in the future and date from now. Oh, that's not the word reverse. Don't try and type as you say things. You just end up writing the wrong things down. Now, while I'm trying to follow the energy of what's working for me right now, I want to start thinking of other ways I might break this, and I'm going to just look at one of the fields individually for now. So ways that a date might be invalid, and this could apply to any business domain you work in. You don't have to think about football fixtures. We all work with things like dates of birth and just dates of the year. What if we have a valid year, a valid month, February, but a date that doesn't exist in that year? So the 31st of February, for example. Now, depending on what language you're using, different things might happen. I know in PHP, which is the devil's own language, if you ask it to get data for the 31st of February, it tries to be clever and it goes, oh, you must mean the 3rd of March because that's 3 days after the last day of February. And really weird things start to happen. If we see that behavior happening in this test case, I might suddenly spawn out a whole load more test cases because I can just think of loads more things that might go wrong. What about, obviously the 29th of February is a valid date, but 2019 wasn't a leap year. So if I ask for matches on the 29th of February 2019, what happens there? What about the 29th of February in a year that is a leap year? So the current year, there is a 29th of February. I don't know whether Liverpool played on it or not, but we'll see whether it's treated as a valid date. Fundamentally incorrect things like the 15th month of the year, the 1st of the 15th month, or the 40th of September. Again, they match that validation pattern, but they're not valid dates. So how does the system treat them? Again, I hope some kind of 4xx code, like a bad request. We shall see. Things that look like years but are never going to be years. The 1st of January 1999. Let's see what happens on that. So far I've assumed this pattern matching is being validated, but again, let's do things like a 0 and a foo and a 2-digit year and a 1-digit month. Let's split those up into separate cases. So a 2-digit year, a 1-digit month, a 1-digit day. Now I'm going to go across to the test heuristics cheat sheet because that's got a load of things about dates that I might not have thought of yet, just to save time. Again, it talks about things like time zones. Shouldn't be an issue. Leap days we've mentioned. Days that are always invalid we've covered. February 29th in non-leap years we've covered. Different formats. It looks like there's some kind of format validation in place, but again, let's try something that is loosely a date but isn't good. It shouldn't match that validation. So the 1st of January but with slashes instead of dashes. That looks like a date but it isn't. Again, that looks like a date but it isn't as far as the API is concerned. And you know what, that's going to do for now. Otherwise you're just watching me type into a text document. So let's stick these side by side with Postman and hammer through a few of them. I did mention there is a rate limit on this API on the free account. You're limited to, I think it's 10 a minute, so 1 every 6 seconds. So let's step through these relatively slowly so that we don't lose access to the system. But I'm going to start from the top. If we have a date from, but not a date to, so show me all the matches starting on the 1st of October, but not an end date. It might tell me I need to have a date to, or it might show me all the matches for the rest of the season. Let's have a look. Parameter date from must be used in conjunction with date to, and vice versa. Thanks API, that's a useful error message. We get a 400, it's a bad request. So that means I can skip over the next one as well. It looks like that should work. Hey, you know what, we're testers, we don't skip over them. Maybe the message is lying. If we just put a date to, yep, that confirms that we need to have them both. If date to is before the date from, so to, and put from first so that I get my head around it. No, from makes sense to be first. From October, and date to is September. That logically doesn't make sense. Does it handle it, or is it a bad request? Parameter date from must be dated before the one specified in date to. Wording not great. I'll completely let the API developer off. He's a German guy who is amazing. He's perfectly happy to have conversations with me when I find bugs in the underlying data feeds that he uses. I've never had any problems with the API itself, but the data that feeds into that API is sometimes a bit squiffy. But yeah, I can forgive a badly worded message. That does not affect my usability of the system. I'm happy to go on from that. Date from the same as date to. So we said Liverpool have a match on the 20th of October. If I put that in both, do I get just one match back? I'm hoping the answer is yes. Count 1. And if we go down, I'm just going to collapse this. There is one entity within the matches node, and it should be that match from the 20th of October. Confirmed. And if they are the same but there was no match, again, I'm gaining confidence in the system here, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a thing back that's valid but has no matches in it because the API looks pretty good. There we go, count 0. It does also reconfirm what the thing was that you did. Date from massively in the past. So if I ask for 4 seasons worth of data, I don't know if the system has it in there, for example, but okay, specified period must not exceed 750 days. Now we're testers. Again, we see a message, we can't let it lie. Let's make sure that this accepts exactly 750 days and no more. The easiest way to do that is to go to Google. We'll start with this date and say, Google's normally pretty good with this sort of thing. 750 days before that date. Sunday, the 1st of October 2017. So the 1st of October? My memory is shocking. So that should be a range that is exactly 750 days, and so it should be acceptable. It is. It's only got 100 messages back, 100 matches back because there is a limit of 100. Now, one of the things we're going to come back to later is the limit. So what I'm going to do to remind myself of this for later, just as an aide-memoire. Hello to everyone translating French in the subtitles. Thank you very much. So when we're doing the limit test cases later, I'm going to move this out of the way. It's probably, I just realised my camera is probably in the way of where I was just typing. I've just put a note down the bottom. When I get to limit, that's a test case I would like to look at, is 750 days. Just a reminder, that's the max limit. We'll see what happens when we get to that. Back to Postman, and we'll carry on with these for now. If I put this back one more day then to the 30th of September 2017, that should be 751 days, and we should see that error message again. And we have. Cool. There's something that I never knew existed in the API, and I can see that it's being enforced correctly. Again, you could probably come up with other ones like having 750 days into the future and things like that, but for the sake of moving on with it today, I don't want to exhaust my energy too much. Let's quickly hammer through some invalid dates. 31st of February. Now that's interesting. Ha ha ha. Remember exactly what I said. Now I'm not saying that this is using PHP in the back end. There may be other languages that do it. But that's behaviour I've seen in other languages where I ask for the 31st of February. It says, very well, here's the 3rd of March. Now, is that acceptable? It depends upon your use cases. In things like financial systems, just casually allowing a few extra days of data to creep into your system may be a really bad idea. If you're gathering accounts, for example. It echoes back here what it's actually done. So it's visible to the user what's actually gone on. I'm a little bit surprised in that there are so many other validations we've seen in the system that work really well. I thought it might be a bit more thorough on that. It probably means that the 29th of February, which isn't a date that exists, will come back as the 1st of March. It does. I'm going to stick this in my questions at the top. And I'm going to call it, for my own benefit, date wraparound, e.g. 31st of Feb. That's something that I might go back to the developer in the real world and say, are we happy with this? I might ask the product owner, can we think of any side effects that this might happen if we do this? 29th of February in a real leap year. I'm going to move this date forward because I've just remembered the 750 day limit. So let's make it back into smaller range again. That confirms it really does go to the 29th of February. Did Liverpool have a game on the 29th of February? Let's see. They did. What did they do on the 29th of February? Fact fans. They lost 3-0 to Watford. Did they really? Liverpool had an awesome season. Sorry for the digression. Watford 3, Liverpool 0. Was that a thing? Indeed it was. And it was their first defeat of the season. They were unbeaten most of the way through the season, then they got hammered by Watford. I support a team in the 3rd tier of English football, so my Premier League football knowledge, not the best. You can see also how I get very easily sidetracked when I'm supposed to be testing things. But that passes that test case. We can see that's a valid date. This one's a bit more interesting. We saw the weird wraparound behaviour. What if the month is a month that doesn't even exist? It surely can't do anything logical with that. Or will it? Will it try and go to March 2020? Maybe it has, because it says date from must be before date 2. It has, 2019 1501 comes back as the 1st of March. Again, maybe it's not awful fallback behaviour. Maybe it's not a critical system for this, but it's a bit weird. And so again, I think we can see that the 40th of September will be the 10th of October. He says doing late night maths. Yeah, there you go. More weird date wraparound behaviour. Anything could happen now when we're talking about year 9999. Just give us the calendar year 9999. Do we get an empty list back because there are no matches? Or it's been the heat death of the universe? It's valid apparently. It reconciles as a date. Presumably if we go to 5-digit years, that won't fit that pattern, so it will say that's an invalid date. There we go. That's the first time we've actually seen that message. Date from or date to, not in expected format. Interestingly, and this is very pedantic, the format that it says it's expecting is 4 lowercase y's for year. In the documentation, it says 4 uppercase y's. Now, again, depending on what masking that's using, I don't know whether that's important. Like, what does 4 lowercase y's mean versus uppercase y's? Again, if it's PHP date, I'm going to bring up the PHP date documentation because I look at it far too often. I have some pet projects that are done in PHP. And if I look for YYYY in this documentation, this isn't the documentation I was expecting. There's better documentation out there. This one? Where's the one? Here we go. Okay, it's not PHP because PHP uses a single uppercase Y to mean 4 digits. And a single lowercase y to mean 2 digits. So that's hence my confusion there. I know that sometimes casing can be important, but A, this isn't PHP, and B, it's not really that important. That tells me as a developer what I've done wrong. I'm happy with that to move on from dates. Let's look then very quickly, because I don't want this episode to drag on too long. We'll look at let's go to status next, because again, status is, well, what does that even mean? Thankfully, the documentation is good and tells us what statuses are. It tells us that it expects, again, there's a regular expression there, which is it's got to be alphanumeric. Interestingly, and a note that I'm going to make for the test cases, in a regular expression, uppercase A to uppercase Z means it will only accept uppercase. Does this mean that this parameter won't accept lowercase? I'm going to make a note of that there. We should do a happy path, making sure that statuses actually work. And it lists here what the valid statuses are, so I'm just going to copy and paste this into my text file. Now this again is something where having some domain knowledge might help. Like for example, I know that scheduled means it's a match that's scheduled for the future. It hasn't actually happened yet. Live and in play both sound very similar. It sounds like a match is in progress, but there's nothing in the documentation to explain what they mean. Not on this page anyway. There are more pages in the documentation. If I delve deeper, I might find it. Does paused mean half time, or that there's been a break in play for some reason? Finished presumably means the match is finished. You've got postponed and cancelled. That's interesting. And suspended, does that mean abandoned? You can have matches that are abandoned. If a match is abandoned because of bad weather, for example, does that mean it's cancelled or suspended? These are the things that you would normally ask the system developers. Now, first things first, let me just see if we've got any future matches in the system. If I put the current date in there, that's not the current date, we're in September now. Where's the year going? Show me matches from September to November 2020. Do we have scheduled matches? We do. There's some matches with status scheduled. Now I put this back to March, so that these results now include some matches in the past and some in the future. And now I apply, this is my happy path test. If I say and status equals scheduled, that's not how you spell scheduled. Does it filter it back to just the matches in the future? Yes, again, it mirrors back. You asked for matches in status scheduled, and there are some back. So let's iterate through a few things we might do with statuses. I mentioned the lowercase test. So a valid value but lowercase. Valid but lowercase. Let's do a valid word, so it passes the regular expression, but it's not a real status. So foo, again, for example. A match that doesn't have any matches in that status. So postponed, for example, if Liverpool didn't have any postponed matches in that time, and I don't know how it's treated the coronavirus matches, so there may actually be some. So I'll put or some other status with no matches. Let's check that we get no results back. A question I might ask the developer is it possible to pass multiple values in? The documentation makes it look like it's only expecting a single status. But we could try that, for example. If we did status equals scheduled and status equals finished, do we get both lots of matches back, or does one override the other? Other values, we could do stuff like the 0 test, but again, 0 isn't a valid value, so that's a value that's not in that range. I'm not overly bothered with that right now. Again, my mind is drawing a blank, so let's go back to the test heuristics cheat sheet and look for obvious things we could do with strings. Long strings. Now, to be honest, I'm going to skip tests like sending a 1,000 character string. In my mind, that's like a performance/security test in a production environment. I don't want to run something which has the ability to bring a system down, so we're not going to do that. Accented characters, probably not relevant in a system with a fixed set of strings that don't have accents, but it's a really good test to do normally. Does your system, if it's storing data, for example, and you send an accented character in, I've been dealing with a support case in the real world today where one of our systems loses accented characters somewhere in the chain. Asian characters, brackets blank. It looks like the PDF conversion loses Asian characters. There's a bug in the test heuristics cheat sheet. Characters that are commonly used as delimiters. So, for example, if you sent the value foo hat bar, does that do anything weird to the system? Leaving it blank, that's a good one actually. So status equals, but then don't put anything after it. Does it just bring everything back? Single space, we could do that as well. status equals, I just put in brackets there, space. Various other things I mentioned, we're not going to do SQL injection or things like that. That'll do for now. That's a pretty good range of let's see what's going to happen. And at this point, I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch Postman to show params, because editing that URL all the time is a pain. Let's just do it straight down here. It's going to be a bit easier. I'm going to put some line breaks in here just so I can move this to the top of the screen and stick it at the side and my silly face isn't in the way. We did the happy path test already. So having done schedule matches and seeing there are 10 scheduled, what about if we send that lowercase? Is it acceptable? It is not. Again, it's using techie kind of language, but this is aimed at an API integrator, so that's probably fine. Again, it should be one of these values. Does that list match the list that we were told to expect? Scheduled, live, in play with an underscore, yes. Paused, finished, postponed, suspended, cancelled, yes. So, okay, it's not accepted, that's fine. Presumably then if we send any other value such as uppercase but not real, it will give us the same message, yes. Postponed, we said maybe there aren't any matches that are postponed, so is that valid and there are no results? Let's look. That is correct. What about if we send, I don't know whether this tab will let me send the same things through twice. Let's have a look. Maybe it will. There we go. We found our first internal server error. Now, I suspect if I told you Daniel was great. This is my fault. That's not fair on you, Daniel. I've misused the system, but I have managed to find a 500 error. That's probably not a valid use case. I will delete that and bow my head in shame. If I do try and do other things like send comma separated lists, presumably it will either work or give me that message saying it must be in the valid range. Okay, cool. Comma separated works, but it didn't say so in the docs. So that's nice to know. So I've got 10 back. If I now also include completed. Completed isn't a word. The word I wanted was finished. Read the docs, Neil. Then there we go, 21. So you can send multiple. You have to do it in a single stated attribute. If you do it multiple times, you get the infamous internal server error. If I leave status blank, I'd hope that is being handled. We don't get an internal server error. It just ignores it. We can see from that filter section where previously it's echoed back the value put in. There's nothing there. So if it encounters blank or a space, if I move this earlier in the URL parameters, so we have the ability to put a space in. Okay, single space is known to not be a valid value. That's interesting that a space is syntactically different to a blank value. Not massively concerned. It's my own fault as an integrator for not doing that properly. I'm kind of happy with what we've done there. I might put in my questions internal server error. In fact, I can lift my exact example because I wrote it in this document. That generates internal server error. We might like to try and mop those up, really. It should probably return a bound request. It should detect there are multiple parameters, or it should handle it. It should treat that the same as scheduled, comma, finished. I'm going to stop this for now as an exercise for the reader. If they wanted to go ahead and do venue and limit being numeric, we know it can go up to 750. You know, it's staring me in the face. I'm going to have to do it because we identified it earlier. Let's at least do this single test for limit before we wrap up. Dun, 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 dun. And limit equals 750. So we know that is a 750 day date range. Give us all the matches in that range. Apparently Liverpool played 105 matches in that range. It sounds realistic. I'm not going to sit here and go through it now. It looks to me like limit is probably doing what it should. I can't resist looking for errors. I'm going to type a -5 limit. It accepted it. That's a bit weird. And limit 0 for luck. It's also accepted. And limit 1 will presumably give us the first match in that range. Okay. It's doing things with limits. You might like to go away and try some more for yourself. Like I say, you can just go onto the Football Data website. It's really easy to just sign up and look at. Another resource that I'll link to in the show notes is a resource called the Big List of Naughty Strings. It kind of goes beyond what we're trying to do today because there's a lot of things that are designed to crash systems which we don't want to do, but again, when you talk about things like numerics, the fact that you could got exponents, so 1e2 is technically resolves to a number, but would that be accepted as a numeric value? Would it be treated as numeric? Sometimes you might want it to be, sometimes you might not want it to be. And again, these are all useful discussions you can have with a developer as they're building the system to make sure you're building something that everyone actually wants to do the thing that it should. I also touched briefly upon this tool that we didn't look at. I'll save mind map for a future episode. If you've not used mind maps, it's a really useful way of presenting information in a very visual way and to keep track of where you're up to. So I might, let's just type in here quickly, matches endpoint as my central node. And then the things we looked at today, we looked at the ID parameter, we looked at date from, we looked at date to, and then we might list off the various cases we looked at. So we could actually sit here and list them all off. And if you imagine, if I built this up throughout what we've just done, it would have taken a long time, but there will be a massive list of everything we've done. And it's a really good way of demonstrating the value that a tester brings. Like, you know, I didn't just test this endpoint, I did all of this. And it really helps you to visualize where maybe there are gaps in test coverage. You know, if there's a single node that you're like, well, why is there only 2 tests over here? Can we think of any more? You can go to things like the Heuristics cheat sheet and then maybe build up those there. We'll look at mind map in a future episode. Basically, that's kind of mission accomplished. We looked at a single API endpoint that's out there in the wild. We generated a load of test cases. We ran load them against the endpoint using Postman and found a couple of surprises along the way. So that's everything I want to do for this episode. We're going to do something very similar in the next one. We're going to do another exploratory test session where I generate some ideas and then run them. But we're going to do it a bit differently. Rather than just using my notepad documentation or a mind map, I'm going to use a tool called Testbuddy, which has been created for testers to use to actually help track exploratory testing and to record information along the way that they find. I know about it by reputation. I know Simon Tomes, who's involved with creating it. I know it's very highly regarded, but I've never used it myself, and I'm really interested in getting my teeth into it live on camera. So expect that in episode 4 next week. If you've got this far, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. Feel free to submit your own ideas for test cases or find your own bugs and let me know. But as I say, this is a real system. Please don't go wild or do anything horrible with it. Thank you very much to Daniel for creating this fabulous resource that I use in the wild. Please like and subscribe. I hate saying it, but it really does help. It's really great to see new subscribers coming on board. Thank you everyone who's done it along the way. Thank you so much also to Michael Bolton, who shared the last episode on Twitter, and we saw a massive spike in visitors after that. See you next week, everybody. Bye.